Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is bet everything on someone everyone else has given up on. Sometimes a single act of faith can change two lives forever. In the frontier town of Grim Hollow, Elsa McKenna stands at a human auction with her last 2 silver coins. She needs help saving her ranch, but when she sees the man they call Lot 9, everything changes. He bears the feared tattoo of the Iron Veil gang across his chest. The crowd steps back in terror, but Elsa sees something different in his empty eyes. Against all reason, she bids. Against all odds, she wins. Now she's brought home a stranger called Shade, a man with a dark past and an uncertain future. But what happens when saving her land means risking everything to save a soul that everyone believes is already lost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the McKenna ranch house, its golden light doing little to hide the decay that had crept into every corner of what was once a thriving homestead. Elsa McKenna sat on the sagging steps, her calloused hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had belonged to her mother. The coffee inside had long since grown cold, but she held on to it anyway, drawing comfort from the familiar weight and warmth of memory. At 28, Elsa carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned early that life rarely offered second chances. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver from worry and sun, was pulled back in a practical braid that hung down her back. Her Clothiza faded blue work shirt and worn denim pants spoke of function over fashion, of a woman who had no time for vanity when survival demanded every ounce of her attention. The ranch spread out before her like a testament to broken dreams, fence posts tilted at awkward angles, their wire connections sagging or snapped entirely. The barn's red paint had faded to a dusty rust color, and several shingles had blown off the roof during last winter's storms. In the distance, the remnants of her father's cattle herd, perhaps 30 head, where there had once been 300 grazed on the sparse grass that struggled to grow in the drought-hardened earth. 3 years had passed since the fever took both her parents within a week of each other, leaving Elsa alone with a mountain of debt and a ranch that seemed to lose a piece of itself with each passing season. The drought had been merciless, lasting 2 full years now with no sign of breaking. Wells had run dry across the territory, and what little water remained commanded prices that turned neighbors into competitors and friends into strangers. She reached into her shirt pocket and pulled out a faded photograph, its edges soft from countless handlings. The image showed her family in better times. Her father, Robert McKenna, tall and proud beside her mother, Sarah, whose gentle smile seemed to promise that everything would always be right with the world. Young Elsa stood between them, perhaps 12 years old, grinning at the camera with the confidence of a child who believed her parents could solve any problem. Behind them in the photograph stood the ranch house as it had been then freshly painted, with flower boxes beneath the windows and a vegetable garden that had fed them through many harsh winters. Those flower boxes now sat empty, their wood grey and cracked. The garden had become a patch of stubborn weeds that even the drought couldn't kill. "You'd know what to do," she whispered to the photograph, as she had so many times before. You always knew what to do. But Robert McKenna had never faced the kind of desperation that now pressed against his daughter like a physical weight. The bank in Grim Hollow held the deed to the ranch, and come winter, if she couldn't make good on the payments, everything her family had built would be sold to the highest bidder. The irony wasn't lost on her that she might end up homeless while attending an auction where human beings were sold like livestock to pay their debts. The debt auctions had started 2 years ago, when the territorial government decided that prison was too expensive for those who couldn't pay what they owed. Instead, debtors could work off their obligations in service to whoever bid highest for their labor. It was supposed to be temporary, a few months, perhaps a year at most. But Elsa had heard the stories of men and women who disappeared into the service of cruel masters, never to be seen again. Still, she needed help, desperately. The ranch required work that was beyond her physical capabilities: alone fence repairs, well digging, barn maintenance, and a dozen other tasks that demanded strength she simply didn't possess. Hiring help would have been the sensible solution, but hiring help required money she didn't have. That left the auction. She folded the photograph carefully and returned it to her pocket, then reached for the small leather pouch that contained her last Hope II silver coins that had once belonged to her grandmother. Family legend claimed they were lucky, that they had brought prosperity to 3 generations of McKennas. Elsa had been saving them for the darkest hour, and if this wasn't it, she couldn't imagine what would be. The ride into Grim Hollow took an hour on her father's old mare, a gentle bay named Patience, who had seen better days but still carried Elsa with steady determination. The town sat in a valley between 2 hills like something that had been dropped there by accident and never quite found its proper place. Main Street was a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support: the general store, the saloon, the bank, and the courthouse where the auctions were held. As Elsa tied Patience to the hitching post outside the courthouse, she could already hear the murmur of voices from within. A crowd had gathered, as it always did on auction days. Some came to bid, others simply to witness the spectacle of human desperation put on display. She recognized most of the faces ranchers like herself, though most were in better financial shape, business owners from town, and the occasional drifter looking for cheap labor. The courthouse itself was a grand building by Grim Hollow standards, with tall windows and a clock tower that had stopped working years ago. Inside, wooden benches faced a raised platform where Judge Morrison conducted the proceedings. Morrison was a thin man with silver hair and eyes that suggested he took no pleasure in his duties, but saw them as necessary evils in maintaining order. Elsa found a seat near the back, her fingers worrying the leather pouch that contained her silver coins. Around her, conversations hummed with the casual cruelty of people discussing livestock. She heard estimates of physical strength, assessments of likely endurance, and crude jokes about the circumstances that had brought the debtors to this point. "Lot 7 looks sturdy enough," said a man to her left. A rancher named Carver, whose spread bordered the territorial boundary. "Might get some good work out of him before he breaks." "I heard Lot 9 is trouble," replied his companion, a woman Elsa didn't recognize. "Word is he's got connections to some bad people, Iron Veil gang-type connections." At the mention of the Iron Veil gang, several nearby conversations stopped. The name carried weight in these part stories of midnight raids, missing travelers, and settlements that woke up to find their young men gone and their supplies vanished. They were ghosts of the frontier, appearing and disappearing like smoke, leaving only fear and whispered warnings in their wake. "Why would they auction off one of theirs?" Carver asked. "Maybe he's not one of them anymore," the woman replied. "Maybe he crossed them, and this is what's left." Elsa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the courthouse's stone walls. She had heard the stories too, and the thought of the Iron Veil gang sent ice through her veins. But she also knew that sometimes stories grew in the telling, becoming larger and more terrible than the truth they were based on. Judge Morrison stepped up to the platform, his gavel in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin with Lot 1. Thomas Harper, age 34, convicted of failure to pay territorial taxes in the amount of $47. Opening bid is $10. And so it began. One by one, men and women were led onto the platform, their debts and circumstances announced like cattle being prepared for slaughter. Elsa watched with growing unease as her neighbors bid on human beings with the same casual interest they might show for farm equipment. Some of the debtors looked resigned, others defiant, but all carried the weight of defeat in their shoulders. When they called Lot 9, the atmosphere in the courthouse changed. Conversations stopped. Bodies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even Judge Morrison seemed to hesitate before reading from the paper in his hand. The man who walked onto the platform was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair that hung past his collar and several days' worth of beard shadowing his jaw. His clothes were rough and travel-worn, and iron shackles bound his wrists and ankles. But it was the tattoo that drew every eye in the rumor-jagged black mark across his collarbone, visible through the torn fabric of his shirt. Elsa had never seen the Iron Veil Gang's mark in person, but she recognized it from the wanted posters that occasionally made their way to town. It was meant to look like a veil being torn, with rough edges that suggested violence and death. Seeing it now, on a living man standing just 30 feet away, made her mouth go dry. "Lot 9, Judge Morrison announced, his voice carrying less confidence than it had for the previous auctions. "No name given? Convicted of association with known criminals and failure to provide territorial identification. Sentence of labor to be determined by the purchaser. Opening bid is $5. Silence filled the courthouse. Elsa could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she studied the man on the platform. He stood straight despite the shackles, his chin raised in a gesture that might have been pride or defiance. His eyes swept the crowd, and when they passed over her, she felt something like recognition, though she was certain they had never met. Those eyes were what held her attention. They weren't cruel or calculating, as she might have expected from someone connected to the Iron Veil Gang. Instead, they seemed empty, hollowed out, like windows looking into an abandoned house. There was pain there, and something that might have been regret, but not the cold malice she had heard described in the stories. $5, Judge Morrison repeated. "Do I hear $5? More silence. Elsa could feel the fear in the room like a living thing, pressing against everyone present. No one wanted to bid on a man who might bring the Iron Veil Gang's attention to their doorstep. No one wanted to risk the possibility that they might be purchasing their own destruction. $4, the judge tried, desperation creeping into his voice. Surely someone can make use of. $2 silver, Elsa heard herself say, the words leaving her mouth before her mind had fully processed the decision. Every head in the courthouse turned toward her. She felt the weight of their stares, saw the mixture of shock and disapproval on familiar faces. Carver was looking at her as if she had lost her mind, and perhaps she had. But something about the man on the platform, something about the emptiness in his eyes and the way he held himself despite his circumstances, had reached past her fear and touched a place in her heart that still believed in second chances. 2 silver coins from Miss McKenna, Judge Morrison said, relief evident in his voice. "Do I hear any other bids?" The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of shifting bodies and nervous coughs. Finally, the judge raised his gavel. "Sold to Miss McKenna for 2 silver coins." As the gavel fell, sealing her fate, Elsa caught the man's eyes again. This time, instead of emptiness, she saw something that might have been surprise, followed quickly by what looked like gratitude. He nodded to her, a small gesture that somehow carried the weight of a promise. She had just bought herself a man with connections to the most feared gang in the territory, using the last money she had in the world. As she made her way to the front of the courthouse to complete the transaction, Elsa wondered if she had just saved her ranch or doomed it entirely. But looking into those hollow eyes, she knew she couldn't have made any other choice. The iron shackles around his wrists caught the courthouse's lamplight as Elsa approached the platform, each link a reminder of the gravity of what she had just done. Judge Morrison looked relieved to have concluded the auction of Lot 9, though his expression suggested he thought Elsa had made a terrible mistake. "Miss McKenna," he said, holding out his hand for payment. 2 silver coins as bid." Elsa's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the leather pouch and withdrew her grandmother's coins. They were old Spanish pieces, worn smooth by generations of McKenna hands, and letting them go felt like severing her last connection to the family's better days. But she placed them in the judge's palm without hesitation. "The prisoner is your responsibility now," Morrison continued, producing a thick iron key. "These shackles remain your property, should you choose to continue using them. The territorial government assumes no liability for his actions while in your service." The man her man now, she realized with a start, stood motionless as Morrison unlocked the chains around his ankles. The iron cuffs around his wrists remained, their weight causing his shoulders to slope forward slightly. Up close, Elsa could see the full extent of the tattoo that had terrified the courthouse. The jagged lines were deeper and more intricate than they had appeared from her seat, etched into his skin with the kind of permanence that spoke of serious commitment or serious mistake. "What's your name?" she asked quietly, aware that the remaining crowd was watching their every interaction. He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face as if trying to understand what kind of person would bid on a man like him. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than she had expected, scratched raw by thirst or disuse. "They called me Shade." Not his real name, then. A nickname, or perhaps a name chosen to replace whatever he had been called before the tattoo marked him as dangerous. Elsa nodded, accepting the evasion for now. "I'm Elsa McKenna. You'll be working on my ranch." "I know who you are," he said, surprising her. "Your father was Robert McKenna. Good man. Heard he passed." The casual knowledge of her family history sent a chill down her spine. How did a man connected to the Iron Veil gang know about her father? Robert McKenna had been many things: rancher, community leader, honest businessman, but he had never moved in the kind of circles where outlaws would have learned his name. "How did you—" "Word travels," Shade said simply, "even to bad places." Judge Morrison cleared his throat impatiently. "Miss McKenna, if you're finished with the social pleasantries, I have other business to attend to." She took the hint, gathering the chain that connected Shade's wrist shackles and leading him toward the courthouse door. The crowd parted before them like water, people stepping back and averting their eyes, as if looking directly at the Iron Veil tattoo might bring some terrible curse down upon them. Outside, the afternoon sun seemed harsh after the courthouse's dim interior. Shade squinted against the light, and Elsa noticed that his skin had the pale quality of someone who had spent considerable time indoors or underground. Prison, most likely, though she didn't know where or for how long. "Can you ride?" she asked, leading him toward where patients waited at the hitching post. "Yes." "Good. It's an hour to the ranch." She untied Patience's reins and looked around the town square, realizing she hadn't thought through the logistics of transporting a shackled man. "You'll have to ride behind me. The horse can carry us both." Shade nodded, moving toward Patience with surprising gentleness. The mare, who could be skittish around strangers, stood calmly as he approached. He murmured something under his breath, words too soft for Elsa to catch, and Patience's ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm. Elsa mounted first, then extended her hand to help Shade climb up behind her. The chains around his wrists made the process awkward, but he managed to settle onto Patience's back without putting too much of his weight on Elsa. She could feel the warmth of his body against her back, a presence that was both reassuring and unsettling. As they rode out of Grim Hollow, Elsa became aware of the stairs following them. Windows in shops and houses framed curious faces, and more than one person stepped out onto the boardwalk to get a better look at the woman who had bought the dangerous man. She kept her eyes forward and urged Patience into a steady trot, eager to put the town behind them. The ride to the ranch passed in silence, broken only by the sound of hoofbeats and the creak of leather. Shade sat still behind her, his breathing steady and controlled. Occasionally, she felt him shift his weight as they navigated rougher terrain, but he never spoke or made any move that seemed threatening. As they crested the hill that overlooked the McKenna ranch, Elsa felt a familiar twist of shame at the property's condition. Seeing it through a stranger's eye, a stranger who might be a criminal maid, the decay seemed more pronounced. The sagging fence line, the weathered buildings, the sparse pasture where her remaining cattle grazed it, all looked like the aftermath of defeat. "This is it," she said, more to break the silence than because explanation was needed. Shade said nothing, but she felt him turn his head to take in the full scope of the ranch. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "Good bones," he said quietly. "Place has good bones." They rode down the hill toward the barn, where Elsa dismounted and tied Patience to a post near the water trough. Shade slid down from the horse's back with fluid grace, landing lightly despite the handicap of his shackled wrists. Up close, In the better light of her own property, Elsa could see more details about her purchase. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 30 or 31, with the kind of lean build that came from hard work rather than soft living. His hands, despite the shackles, showed calluses that spoke of familiarity with tools and labor. A thin scar ran along his left jawline, and another disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt. Whatever life he had lived before the auction, it had not been an easy one. "There's a lean, too, behind the barn," she said, falling back on the practical concerns that had driven her to the auction in the first place. "You can sleep there. I'll bring you blankets and such after we get you settled." Shade nodded, following her as she led the way around the barn to a small structure that had once housed her father's tools. It was basic shelter, 3 walls and a roof, but it would keep the rain off and provide some privacy. "Are you planning to keep me shackled?" he asked, raising his chained wrists. The question stopped Elsa cold. In her focus on completing the transaction and getting him to the ranch, she hadn't thought beyond the immediate logistics. The shackles were supposed to be her security, her protection against the dangerous man she had purchased. But looking at him now, standing quietly in the shadow of her family's barn, she found it difficult to reconcile the feared iron veil tattoo with the man who had spoken gently to her horse and complimented her property's potential. "I don't know," she admitted. "Judge Morrison said they were mine to use or not." "I won't run," Shade said. "Where would I go? Every lawman in the territory knows this face now, knows this mark." He touched his collarbone where the tattoo was visible. "And I owe you a debt for what you did back there." "You don't owe me anything. I bought your labor, not your loyalty." "Maybe, but you saw something in me that nobody else in that courthouse saw, that counts for something." Elsa studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. All she saw was a tired man who seemed genuinely grateful for a chance at something better than whatever fate had awaited him if no one had bid. "The work is hard," she said finally. "Fence repair, well maintenance, general ranch work. The place is falling apart and I can't fix it alone. I can work. And I can't pay you anything beyond food and shelter. The ranch is barely surviving as it is. I wasn't expecting wages." Elsa reached into her back pocket and withdrew a smaller keyon that Judge Morrison had given her along with the shackle key. "Your wrist chains. I'll unlock them now, but if you give me reason to regret it." "You won't," Shade said quietly. She unlocked the shackles, and Shade rubbed his wrists where the iron had chafed the skin. He moved his arms and shoulders carefully, working out the stiffness that came from hours of restricted movement. "There's a pump behind the house for washing," Elsa said, stepping back to put some distance between them now that he was unbound. "Outhouse is beyond that. I'll bring you some food, and we can talk about what needs doing first." Shade nodded, looking around the lean-to that would be his home. "Miss McKenna?" "Yes?" "Thank you." The simple words carried weight that made Elsa's chest tight. She nodded and turned away, walking back toward the house with the strange sensation that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet understand. As she climbed the porch steps, she could hear Shade moving around behind the barn, the sounds of a man trying to make himself at home in an unfamiliar place. She had gambled everything on a stranger with a dangerous past, and now there was nothing to do but see whether her instincts had been right or whether she had just invited disaster into her life. That night, as she lay in her parents' old bed listening to the night sounds of the ranch, Elsa found herself straining to hear any sign of movement from the lean-to. But there was only silence, broken occasionally by the distant sound of cattle settling in for the night and the whisper of wind through the broken fence wire. She had bought herself help, but at what cost? Only time would tell whether the man called Shade would be her salvation or her ruin. Dawn broke grey and cold over the McKenna ranch, with the kind of chill that promised winter was not far behind. Elsa woke to the sound of hammering rhythmic, purposeful strikes that seemed to come from the direction of the barn. She dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch to investigate, wrapping her mother's old shawl around her shoulders against the morning air. Behind the barn, she found Shade working on the fence line that separated the pasture from the main yard. He had somehow procured a hammer and nails she, suspected from her father's old toolbox in the lean-to, was methodically replacing the rotted fence post that had been leaning at a dangerous angle for months. "You're up early," she called, walking closer to observe his work. Shade looked up from where he was driving a nail into the new post. "Habit," he said simply. "Figured I might as well make myself useful." Elsa examined the fence post more closely. It was solid work, the post set deep and straight, the rails secured with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of experience. But what caught her attention was where he had found the materials. "Where did you get the wood?" "Found some good pieces in the barn. Looked like they'd been saved for repairs." Shade gestured toward a small pile of lumber that Elsa recognized as boards her father had set aside years ago for exactly this purpose. She had forgotten they were there, buried under years of accumulated tools and supplies. "You found those in one night?" "Couldn't sleep," Shade admitted. "Figured I'd take inventory of what we're working with. You've got more usable material than it looks like from outside. Your father was a careful man." The casual reference to her father gave Elsa pause. Shade spoke as if he had known Robert McKenna personally, though she was certain they had never met. There was something in his tone respect, perhaps even admiration, that suggested familiarity with her father's reputation. "You seem to know a lot about my family for a stranger," she said carefully. Shade's hand stilled on the hammer. "Like I said yesterday, word travels. McKenna name means something in these parts. Means honesty, hard work, fair dealing." He resumed hammering, but his rhythm was more deliberate now. "Means the kind of people who help their neighbors and don't ask questions when someone needs a hand." There was something wistful in his voice, as if he were describing a world he had once known but could no longer be part of. Elsa found herself wondering what kind of life had led him to that auction platform. What choices or circumstances had put the Iron Veil tattoo on his skin? "I'll start breakfast," she said, turning back toward the house. "There's coffee if you want some." "Obliged." As she prepared eggs and bacon in her mother's old cast-iron skillet, Elsa found herself watching Shade through the kitchen window. He worked with steady efficiency, moving from the fence repair to other small tasks around the barn. She noticed that he moved differently than most men, more quietly, with an awareness of his surroundings that seemed almost animal-like. When one of her chickens wandered too close to his work area, he paused to let it pass, rather than shooing it away. After breakfast, which they ate in companionable silence on the porch, Elsa took Shade on a tour of the ranch's most pressing problems. The list was daunting. Fences in 3 different pastures that needed repair or replacement, a well that was producing less water each week, barn doors that hung crooked on their hinges, and a dozen smaller maintenance issues that had accumulated during her years of struggling alone. "What's the priority?" Shade asked, as they stood looking at a section of fence where cattle had pushed through and wandered onto the neighbor's property. "Water," Elsa said without hesitation. "Without water, nothing else matters. The cattle, the horses, the garden, everything depends on the well." Shade nodded, walking over to examine the pump mechanism. He worked the handle a few times, listening to the sounds it made, then knelt down to peer into the machinery. "When did it start producing less?" "About 6 months ago. Gradually at first, then more noticeably." "Pump's working fine," Shade said, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. "Problem's probably deeper. Could be the water tables dropped from the drought, or there might be something blocking the pipe down below." "Can it be fixed?" "Maybe. Would need to pull the pipe and see what we're dealing with. It's not easy work, might take a couple of days, and no guarantee of success." Elsa felt the familiar weight of uncertainty that had become her constant companion. Every decision seemed to carry the risk of wasting time and resources she couldn't afford to lose. "How do you know about wells?" she asked. Shade was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the pump mechanism. "Learned a lot of different things over the years. Moving around, you pick up skills where you can find them." It was another evasion, but Elsa was beginning to understand that Shade's past was a subject he wasn't ready to discuss in detail. She could respect that, as long as his knowledge proved useful. That afternoon, As Shade began the laborious process of disassembling the well pump, Elsa rode out to check on the cattle in the far pasture. She found them clustered around a small spring that had been their backup water source, but even that was running lower than she had ever seen it. On her way back to the house, she encountered her neighbor, Tom Brennan, riding the fence line that separated their properties. Brennan was a good man, one of the few ranchers in the area who had managed to weather the drought without losing everything. His presence usually meant neighborly conversation, but today his expression was troubled. "Elsa," he called, riding over to meet her. "Heard you made quite a purchase yesterday." Word traveled fast in a small community like Grim Hollow. Elsa had expected questions and probably criticism from her neighbors, but she had hoped for at least a day or two before the interrogation began. "I needed help with the ranch," she said simply. "Help, sure, but that particular kind of help." Brennan shook his head. "Elsa, that man's got connections to some very bad people. Iron Veil gang doesn't just let their own get sold at auction. Makes a person wonder what he did to end up there." "Maybe he's not one of them," Elsa said, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. "That tattoo says otherwise, and even if he's not active with them anymore, he's still a target. Gangs don't like loose ends, and they don't forgive betrayal." Brennan's voice carried genuine concern. "You could be putting yourself in danger." Elsa knew Brennan meant well, but his words stirred the defensive instinct that had kept her fighting for the ranch, long past the point where others might have given up. "I appreciate your concern, Tom, but I can take care of myself." "I know you can. Your father raised you right. But Robert McKenna never had to deal with the kind of people who might come looking for that man. If you need help with the ranch, I've got hands who could." "I can't afford to hire anyone," Elsa cut him off. "You know that." Brennan nodded reluctantly. "Just promise me you'll be careful. And if anything seems wrong, anything at all, you send word. Mary and I don't live that far away." "I promise." As Brennan rode away, Elsa felt the weight of isolation that had become all too familiar. Her neighbors cared about her, but they also had their own families and properties to worry about. In the end, she was alone with her choices and their consequences. That evening, as she prepared dinner, she found herself watching Shade through the kitchen window again. He had worked steadily all day on the well, and she could see that he had made significant progress. The pump mechanism lay in carefully organized pieces, and he was examining something that looked like a section of pipe. When she called him for dinner, he approached the house with what appeared to be good news. "Found the problem," he said, holding up a piece of metal that had been corroded beyond recognition. "Filters completely clogged with mineral deposits. Probably been building up for years, but the drought made it worse." "Can you fix it?" "Need to make a new filter, but yeah, should have water flowing normal again by tomorrow evening." Relief flooded through Elsa with an intensity that surprised her. She had been preparing herself for the possibility that the well was finished, that she would have to find another water source or abandon the ranch entirely. That's wonderful news." Shade seemed pleased by her reaction, a small smile crossing his face. It was the first genuine expression of pleasure she had seen from him, and it transformed his features entirely. For a moment, he looked less like a dangerous man with a feared tattoo, and more like someone who took satisfaction in solving problems and helping others. As they ate dinner on the porch, watching the sun set over the distant mountains, Elsa found herself thinking about Tom Brennan's warnings. She had bought Shade because she needed help, but she was beginning to realize that her motivations might have been more complex than simple necessity. There was something about him, his quiet competence, his gentle treatment of the animals, his obvious knowledge of ranch work, that suggested depths beneath the surface. Whatever had led him to that auction platform, whatever connection he had to the Iron Veil gang, he was proving to be exactly the kind of help she needed. But Brennan's words echoed in her mind as darkness settled over the ranch. Gangs don't like loose ends, and they don't forgive betrayal. If Shade was running from his past, how long would it be before that past came looking for him? And when it did, would she be ready for the consequences of her decision to give him sanctuary? 3 days after fixing the well, Shade had fallen into a rhythm that surprised Elsa with its naturalness. He rose before dawn, worked steadily through the day with brief breaks for meals, and spent his evenings in the lean-to, emerging only when she called him for dinner. It was a pattern that suggested discipline and self-sufficiency, qualities that seemed at odds with the criminal reputation his tattoo implied. On the morning of the fourth day, Elsa discovered something that gave her new insight into the man she had purchased. She had walked around the barn to check on the progress of another fence repair when she heard an unusual sound singing, low and melodic, drifting from the direction of the horse corral. Following the sound, she found Shade working with her father's old gelding, Caesar, who had been lame for months and difficult to handle. The horse stood calmly while Shade examined his front left hoof, and the singing continued in a language Elsa didn't recognize. It sounded native, perhaps Cheyenne or Lakotawith, the kind of flowing rhythm that seemed designed to soothe troubled spirits. "Easy, old friend," Shade murmured in English, still holding Caesar's hoof. "Let's see what's causing you trouble." Elsa watched as he carefully cleaned debris from the hoof, his movements gentle and patient. Caesar, who usually fought any attempt to handle his feet, stood perfectly still. When Shade released the hoof and stepped back, the gelding nuzzled his shoulder in what appeared to be gratitude. "How did you know he was having trouble?" Elsa asked, stepping into view. Shade didn't seem surprised by her presence. "Saw him favoring that foot yesterday. Stone wedged up in there, probably been bothering him for weeks." He patted Caesar's neck. "He's a good horse. Just needed someone to listen to what he was trying to say. My father always said Caesar was the smartest horse he'd ever owned, but he's been so difficult since after Papa died. Won't let me near his feet anymore." "Grief affects animals too," Shade said quietly. "They understand loss, even if they can't talk about it." There was something in his voice that suggested personal experience with both animals and loss. Elsa found herself wondering about his background again, but before she could ask, a child's voice called out from the direction of the house. "Miss Elsa! Miss Elsa!" Turning, she saw young Ben Morrisonth, Judge's 8-year-old grandson, running toward them with the breathless urgency that characterized all of his movements. Ben lived with his grandparents in town and often visited the ranch to help with small chores in exchange for rides on patients. "Ben, what brings you out here?" Elsa asked, though she could guess. News of her purchase at the auction would have reached every household in Grim Hollow by now, and Ben's grandmother had probably sent him to check on her welfare. "Grandmama wanted me to bring you these," Ben said, holding out a cloth bag that smelled of fresh baking, "and to make sure you're all right." Elsa accepted the bag, knowing it would contain Martha Morrison's excellent biscuits. The judge's wife was a kind woman who worried about Elsa living alone, and her baked goods were always a welcome addition to the ranch's simple fare. "That's very kind of her. Tell her I'm doing just fine." Ben's eyes had found Shade, and he stared with the unguarded curiosity of childhood. "Are you the man Grandpa sold to Miss Elsa?" "Ben," Elsa said sharply, but Shade raised a hand to indicate he didn't mind the question. "I suppose I am," Shade said, crouching down to bring himself closer to Ben's eye level. "What's your name, son?" "Benjamin Morrison, but everyone calls me Ben." The boy's initial wariness seemed to be evaporating in the face of Shade's calm demeanor. "Are you really from the Iron Veil gang?" "Ben!" Elsa exclaimed, mortified by the directness of the question. But Shade answered with surprising honesty. "I used to know some people who were in that gang, but I'm not part of that life anymore." "Did you do bad things?" Shade was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes serious as he considered the question. "I made mistakes," he said finally. "Bad choices that hurt people. Now I'm trying to do better." Ben nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. "Grandmama says everyone deserves a chance to be good if they really want to." "Your grandmama sounds like a wise woman." "She is. She makes the best cookies in Grim Hollow too." Ben paused, studying Shade's face with the intense concentration children brought to important decisions. "Do you like horses?" "I do. Caesar used to let me ride him, but he's been grumpy lately. Miss Elsa says his foot hurts." "His foot is better now," Shade said, glancing at Elsa for permission. "If it's all right with Miss Elsa, maybe you could visit with him." Ben looked at Elsa with hopeful eyes, and she found herself nodding despite her instinct to keep the boy away from her mysterious purchase. There was something about the interaction between Shade and Ben that seemed natural and safe, and Caesar was indeed moving more easily now. As Ben led Caesar around the corral, chattering about school and his friends in town, Elsa observed Shade's reaction to the child. His whole demeanor seemed to soften, and he watched Ben with the kind of protective attention she might have expected from an uncle or older brother. "You're good with children," she said. "Had a younger brother once," Shade replied, and for the first time since she had met him, real pain flickered across his features. Long time ago. The past tense and the expression on his face told Elsa not to pursue the subject. Instead, she watched as Ben successfully guided Caesar through a simple pattern around the corral, the horse responding to the boy's gentle commands with restored trust. When Ben finally left, promising to return soon with another message from his grandmother, Elsa and Shade continued working on the fence repairs in comfortable silence. But as the afternoon wore on, she became aware that Shade was fashioning something from a piece of discarded wood, carving it with a small knife during brief breaks in the fence work. "What are you making?" she asked during one of these breaks. Shade held up the partially carved piece. It was taking the shape of a small horse, roughly the size of a child's toy, with careful attention to the proportions and details that would make it recognizable as Caesar. "Thought Ben might like it," Shade said, returning to his carving. "Boy seems fond of horses." The simple kindness of the gesture caught Elsa off guard. Here was a man feared throughout the territory, branded with the mark of killers and thieves, spending his free time carving a toy for a child he had just met. "That's very thoughtful." Shade shrugged, as if such gestures were natural and unremarkable. "Boy's got good instincts about people. Reminds me of—" He stopped himself, but Elsa could guess he had been thinking of his brother again. That evening, as they shared dinner on the porch, 3 riders appeared on the horizon, approaching from the direction of town. Elsa felt Shade tense beside her, his relaxed posture shifting to something more alert and ready. His hand moved unconsciously toward his hip, where a gun belt would have hung if he had been armed. "You expecting visitors?" he asked quietly. "No." Elsa stood to get a better look at the approaching riders. As they came closer, she recognized them as ranch hands from the Carver Spreadman she knew by sight, but not by name. "They're from my neighbor's place." The riders stopped at the edge of the yard, their horses stamping and snorting after the hard ride. The leader, a lean man with graying hair and suspicious eyes, touched his hat brim in a gesture that was more formality than respect. "Miss McKenna," he said. "Name's Dutch Carver's foreman. We're looking for some missing cattle. Wondered if any strays might have wandered onto your property." It was a reasonable request, but something about the man's manner and the way his companions kept glancing at Shade suggested their visit had another purpose. "I haven't seen any Carver cattle," Elsa replied, "but you're welcome to ride the fence line and check." "Obliged." The foreman's eyes fixed on Shade, who had remained seated but was clearly ready to move if necessary. "You'd be the man Miss McKenna bought at auction." "I would," Shade said evenly. "Heard you got some interesting tattoos." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Elsa could feel the tension building between the men, and she recognized the kind of confrontation that could escalate quickly if not handled carefully. "My employee's past is not your concern," she said firmly. "If you want to look for your cattle, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, I'll ask you to move along." The foreman's smile was cold. "Just being neighborly, Miss McKenna. Lot of folks in these parts are concerned about your safety, what with the kind of help you've taken on." "My safety is my own responsibility." "Course it is. But if that help brings the wrong kind of attention to the area, well, that becomes everyone's concern." It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Elsa felt anger rising in her chest, but before she could respond, Shade stood slowly from his chair. "You have something to say to me," he said quietly. "Say it direct." The foreman's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and his companions shifted in their saddles. For a moment, violence seemed inevitable. Then Shade raised both hands, palms out, in a gesture of peace. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "I'm just trying to work and stay out of everyone's way. But if you want to make this about something other than missing cattle, we can do that too." There was something in his voice, a quiet confidence, that suggested he was not intimidated by 3 armed men, that gave the foreman pause. After a tense moment, he relaxed his gun hand and gathered his reins. "Cattle might have wandered toward the creek," he said to Elsa, as if the confrontation had never happened. "We'll check down that way." As the riders moved off toward the creek, Elsa turned to Shade. "What was that about?" "Testing," Shade said simply. "Seeing how I'd react, whether I'm the kind of man who starts trouble or finishes it." "And what did they learn?" Shade's smile was grim. "That I'm not going anywhere." Later that night, as Elsa lay in bed listening to the night sounds of the ranch, she thought about the day's events. Ben's easy acceptance of Shade, the gentle way he had treated Caesar, the toy he was carving for a child. He barely knew all of it, painted a picture that contradicted the feared reputation of his tattoo. But the confrontation with Carver's men reminded her that Shade's past was not something that could be ignored or forgotten. Whatever he had been before coming to her ranch, whatever connection he had to the Iron Veil gang, there were people who saw him as a threat that needed to be neutralized. As sleep finally claimed her, Elsa wondered how long they would be allowed to exist in the peaceful routine they had established. And what would happen when the outside world decided that Shade's presence on her ranch was no longer tolerable? 2 weeks into their arrangement, Elsa woke to find a wounded hawk in the yard, its wing dragging as it tried to escape from Caesar's curious investigation. She rushed outside in her nightgown and robe, intending to shoo the horse away before he accidentally trampled the injured bird, but stopped short when she saw Shade already crouched near the hawk. He moved with infinite patience, speaking in that same native language she had heard him use with Caesar, his hands steady and sure, as he examined the bird's wing. The hawk, which should have been struggling or trying to flee, remained perfectly still under his touch. "How badly is it hurt?" Elsa asked softly, not wanting to startle either the bird or the man tending to it. "Wings not broken," Shade murmured, his attention still focused on the hawk. "Looks like it got tangled in some old fence wire. Cut up pretty good, but it'll heal if it's given the chance." Elsa watched as he carefully untangled a piece of rusted wire from the hawk's wing, his movement so gentle that the bird barely reacted. When he finished, he lifted the hawk in both hands and carried it to a sheltered spot near the barn where it would be safe from predators while it recovered. "You seem to have a way with injured things," she observed. Shade looked at her, and for a moment she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Maybe because I know what it feels like to be hurt and have nowhere to go." The admission hung between them, like a bridge she wasn't sure either of them was ready to cross. But before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the morning stillness. This time it was only one rider, and Elsa recognized Tom Brennan's distinctive bay mare. "Elsa," Brennan called as he approached, his face grave. "We need to talk." Shade melted away toward the barn without being asked, understanding instinctively that this conversation was not meant for his ears. Elsa pulled her robe tighter and met Brennan near the porch. "What's wrong, Tom?" "Had visitors yesterday evening, 3 men asking questions about your hired hand." Brennan dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. "They weren't local." A chill ran down Elsa's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests they're looking for someone specific. They had a good description: tall, dark hair, scar along his jaw, and of course, that tattoo." Brennan's expression was troubled. "They were polite enough, but there was something about them that didn't sit right. Mary said they reminded her of wolves dressed up like shepherds." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. Said I hadn't seen anyone matching that description." Brennan paused. "But Elsa, they weren't just asking at my place. They're working their way through all the ranches in the area. Someone's going to talk eventually." Elsa felt the weight of inevitability settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had known this moment would come, had sensed it in Shade's constant awareness of his surroundings and the way he never truly relaxed, even when the work was going well. Did they say what they wanted with him? Nothing specific, just that they were looking for an old friend who might be in the area. Brennan's tone made it clear he didn't believe their story any more than she did. Elsa, I know you've grown attached to having help around here, but maybe it's time to consider. No, the word came out sharper than she intended. I won't throw him to whatever wolves are hunting him, even if keeping him puts you in danger. It was a fair question, one she had been avoiding, asking herself. But as she thought about the past 2 weeks, the well working perfectly, the fences repaired, the gentle way Shade treated the animals, and the thoughtful toy he was carving for Benche, realized her answer had already been decided. He's not the man they're looking for, she said firmly. Maybe he was once, but not anymore. Brennan studied her face with the concern of an old family friend. You sure about that, or are you just hoping? Before she could answer, a commotion from the direction of the barn drew their attention. Caesar was rearing and snorting, clearly agitated about something. Both Elsa and Brennan rushed toward the sound, and they found Shade trying to calm the gelding while smoke drifted from the barn's interior. Fire? Brennan asked, already moving toward the barn doors. Just a small one, Shade called back, his voice strained as he fought to control Caesar. Knocked over a lantern, got it out, but the smoke spooked him. Elsa ran into the barn and found that Shade had indeed extinguished a small fire that had started in a pile of old hay. The damage was minimal, but the acrid smell of smoke filled the air, and she could see why it had frightened the horse. When she emerged from the barn, she found Brennan watching Shade with interest. Caesar had calmed down and was nuzzling Shade's shoulder, seeking comfort from the man who had saved his home from burning. Quick thinking, Brennan said, and there was approval in his voice. Could have lost the whole barn if you hadn't acted fast. Shade nodded, but Elsa noticed that his hands were trembling slightly as he stroked Caesar's neck. It took her a moment to realize that the trembling wasn't from exertion or adrenalinite, was from fear. The sight of fire had affected him more deeply than he was letting on. You all right? She asked quietly. Fine, Shade said, but his voice was too controlled, too carefully neutral. After Brennan left, carrying with him a promise from Elsa that she would be careful and send word if anything seemed wrong, she found Shade sitting on a pile of lumber behind the barn. He was working on the wooden horse again, but his carving was less steady than usual. The fire, she said, settling down beside him, it reminded you of something. Shade's hands stilled on the carving. Everyone's afraid of something. What happened? For a long time, he didn't answer. The only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the prairie grass. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him. There was a cabin, up in the mountains, place where I thought I could hide, start over maybe. His fingers traced the carved lines of the wooden horse. They found me anyway, burned it down with me inside. The Iron Veil gang? People I used to ride with, people who didn't appreciate my change of heart about certain things. Shade looked at her then, and she saw old pain in his eyes. That's how I got some of these scars, how I learned that running isn't always enough. Is that why you ended up at the auction? They caught you? Eventually, though not the way you might think. Shade resumed carving, his movements more controlled now. Sometimes the law and outlaws want the same man for different reasons. Sometimes a person gets caught between them with nowhere left to run. Elsa was beginning to understand the complexity of Shade's situation. He wasn't just a reformed outlaw trying to go straight, was a man trapped between his past and his future, with enemies on both sides of the law. The men Tom mentioned, she said, they're not lawmen, are they? Probably not. And they're not going to stop looking. No, Shade agreed. They're not. That afternoon, as they worked together to repair a section of corral fencing, Elsa found herself watching Shade with new eyes. The easy competence she had admired was still there, but now she could see the wariness beneath it, the way he constantly scanned their surroundings and positioned himself where he could see all approaches to their location. You don't have to stay, she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Shade looked up from the fence post he was setting. "You want me to go?" "I want you to be safe. And I want you to have a choice." Elsa met his eyes directly. "You don't owe me anything, despite what you said that first day. If staying here puts you in danger—" "Everything puts me in danger," Shade interrupted. "But this is the first place in a long time that's felt like it might be worth the risk." The simple honesty of his words made Elsa's chest tight. She had bought his labor at an auction, but somewhere along the way, she had begun to care about his welfare in a way that had nothing to do with the work he could perform. "Then we need to be ready," she said. "When they come. They might not come here. Lot of ranches to search, and they don't know for certain I'm in the area." But even as he said it, both of them knew it was wishful thinking. Men like the ones Brennan had described didn't give up easily, and they had resources that would eventually lead them to the right place. That evening, Elsa pulled out her father's old rifle and cleaned it thoroughly for the first time since his death. Shade watched her work, his expression thoughtful. "You know how to use that? Papa taught me when I was 12. Said every woman living alone on the frontier needed to be able to protect herself." Elsa worked the rifle's action, checking that it operated smoothly. "I'm a fair shot, though I've never had to fire at anything more dangerous than a coyote. Hopefully you won't have to now. But if I do—" Shade was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket and withdrew something wrapped in an old cloth. When he unwrapped it, Elsa saw a blood-stained bandana, faded and worn but carefully preserved. "What is that?" "Reminder," Shade said, touching the stained fabric gently, "of what I used to be and what I don't want to become again." He told her then about the last job he had ridden with the Iron Veil gang, a raid on a homestead that was supposed to be simple theft but had turned into something much worse. He told her about the family they had found there, about the choice he had made that put him at odds with men he had once called friends. "I used this to bandage a little girl's arm," he said, indicating the blood-stained cloth. "She wasn't much older than Ben. Her family didn't make it, but she did, and I made sure she got to the nearest town safely." "That's when you decided to leave the gang?" "That's when I realized I was never really one of them. Took me longer than it should have to understand the difference between being desperate and being evil." As Elsa absorbed this revelation, she began to understand why the Iron Veil gang might be so determined to find Shade. He wasn't just a former member who had gone strath, was a witness to their crimes, someone who could identify them and testify to their activities. His knowledge made him both valuable and dangerous, depending on whose hands he fell into. "The little girl," she said, "did she survive?" "Far as I know. Last I heard she was living with relatives back east somewhere." Shade carefully rewrapped the bandana. "Sometimes I think about writing her a letter, trying to explain why I couldn't save her family. But what would be the point? Some things can't be explained, only regretted." That night, as Elsa lay in bed, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, she found herself thinking not about the danger that might be approaching, but about the man who was facing it with her. Shade's story had revealed layers of complexity she was still trying to understand. But one thing was clear. Whatever he had been in the past, he was trying to become something better. The question was whether they would be given enough time for that transformation to take root, or whether his past would catch up to them before his future could be secured. The following Sunday brought an unexpected visitor in the form of young Ben Morrison, arriving not with a message from his grandmother, but with tears streaming down his face and a small bundle clutched against his chest. "Miss Elsa," he called, running toward the house where she was hanging laundry on the line. "Miss Elsa, you have to help." Elsa dropped the sheet she was hanging and hurried to meet the boy. "Ben, what's wrong? What happened?" "It's Patches," Ben sobbed, holding out the bundle. "She got hurt, and Grandmama says there's nothing to be done, but I thought maybe—" Inside the old towel was a small calico kitten, barely 6 weeks old, with a badly injured back leg that hung at an unnatural angle. The little creature was alive, but clearly in pain, mewing weakly as Ben held her. "Oh, sweetheart," Elsa said gently, examining the kitten's injury. "This looks pretty serious." "Please don't let her die," Ben pleaded. "She's all I have left of Mama's cat." When Mama died, she left 6 babies, but Patches is the only one left. Elsa's heart broke for the boy. Ben's mother had died in childbirth 2 years ago, leaving him to be raised by his grandparents. She knew how much his few possessions from his mother meant to him. "Ben," came Shade's voice from behind them. "What brings you out here on a Sunday?" Ben turned toward Shade, his face streaked with tears. "It's Patches. She fell from the barn loft and hurt her leg real bad. Grandmama says the kindest thing would be to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Shade approached slowly and gently, took the bundle from Ben's arms. His examination of the kitten was thorough but careful, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he felt along the tiny creature's leg and back. "Leg's broken," he said after a moment. "But it's a clean break. Might heal if it's set right and she's kept quiet." "You can fix her?" Ben asked, hope brightening his tear-stained face. "Maybe. No promises, but I can try." Shade looked at Elsa. "We'll need some thin strips of wood for a splint and something soft to wrap it with." For the next hour, Elsa watched as Shade worked with infinite patience to set the kitten's leg and fashion a tiny splint from pieces of thin cedar. Ben assisted, following Shade's quiet instructions with the seriousness of a surgeon's apprentice. Throughout the procedure, Shade maintained a steady stream of gentle conversation, sometimes directed at the kitten, sometimes at Ben, always in the calm, reassuring tone that seemed to soothe both human and animal anxiety. "There," Shade said finally, settling the splinted kitten into a basket lined with soft rags. "She'll need to stay very quiet for a few weeks while the bone heals. No running, no jumping, just rest and food and patience." "Thank you," Ben whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," Shade cautioned. "She's got a long way to go before we know if this will work." But even as he spoke, the kitten had begun to purr, a tiny motor sound that suggested she was feeling better already. Ben's face lit up with the first real smile Elsa had seen from him since his arrival. "Can I stay and help take care of her?" "If your grandparents say it's all right." Elsa agreed. "But Ben, you understand what Shade told you about no promises, right? Sometimes even when we do everything right, things don't work out the way we hope." Ben nodded solemnly. "I understand, but at least now she has a chance." As they settled the kitten in the barn where she would be safe and warm, Elsa found herself thinking about chances and second opportunities. Like the kitten, Shade had been broken and discarded, written off as beyond help. But given the right care and patience, even the most damaged things could sometimes heal. That afternoon, while Ben sat guard over the sleeping kitten and read to her from a book of fairy tales he had brought from town, Elsa and Shade continued their work on the ranch. They were replacing a section of fence near the creek when Shade suddenly went very still, his attention focused on something in the distance. "What is it?" Elsa asked, following his gaze. "Riders," Shade said quietly, 3 of them, coming up from the south. Elsa shaded her eyes and could just make out the approaching figures. They were still too far away to identify, but something about their purposeful approach made her uneasy. "Could be anyone," she said, though she didn't really believe it. "Could be," Shade agreed, but he was already moving toward the barn where his work tools and Ben were located. The riders approached at a steady pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling. As they drew closer, Elsa could see that they were well armed and well mounted, their horses showing the quality that came with money and care. These were not casual travelers or neighboring ranchers. "Ben," Shade called softly as they reached the barn. "I need you to take Patches into the house and stay there with Miss Elsa until these men leave." "Why?" Ben asked, but he was already gathering up the kitten's basket. "Just being careful," Shade said, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. Elsa started to protest that she wasn't going to hide in her own house, but the expression on Shade's face stopped her. This was the man who had survived years as part of the Iron Veil gang, and his instincts for danger were undoubtedly better than hers. "Come on, Ben," she said, taking his arm. "Let's get Patches settled inside." From the kitchen window, Elsa watched as the 3 riders entered her yard. They were rough-looking men, the kind who carried their violence like a visible aura. The leader was a big man with graying hair and scars that spoke of a hard life. His companions were younger but no less dangerous looking. Shade stood in front of the barn, his posture relaxed but ready. He had positioned himself where he could see all three men clearly, and Elsa noticed that he stayed within reach of the pitchfork he had been using to clean stalls. "Afternoon," the leader called out as they approached. "Name's Kruger. We're looking for someone. Wondered if you might have seen him." "Lot of people pass through," Shade replied evenly. "Who you looking for?" "Fellow about your height and build, dark hair, some scars, and a particular tattoo on his chest." Kruger's smile was cold. "Used to ride with some mutual friends of ours." "Don't know anyone like that." "Funny thing," Kruger continued, dismounting from his horse. "Description, we got matches you pretty close. Mind showing us your chest?" Elsa felt her heart stop. Beside her, Ben looked confused but sensed the tension in the air. In the basket, Patches mewed softly, as if she too understood that something dangerous was happening. "Man's got a right to privacy," Shade said, his hand moving casually closer to the pitchfork. "Sure he does," Kruger agreed. "But we've come a long way, and we're not leaving without some answers." The other two men had dismounted as well, spreading out to flank Shade. They moved with the practiced coordination of men who had done this before, and Elsa realized that diplomacy was about to give way to violence. "Ben," she whispered, "I need you to stay very quiet and don't come out no matter what happens. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide with fear but his grip firm on the kitten's basket. Elsa reached for her father's rifle, which she had begun keeping close since Brennan's warning. Her hands shook as she checked that it was loaded, and she positioned herself at the window where she could see the confrontation clearly. In the yard, the tension had escalated to the breaking point. Kruger was reaching for his gun when Shade suddenly moved, faster than Elsa would have thought possible. The pitchfork became a weapon in his hands, and within seconds one of the flanking men was down and Kruger was backing away, his own weapon only half drawn. "You're quicker than I expected," Kruger said, his voice carrying grudging respect. "But you're still outnumbered." "Maybe," Shade replied, "but I'm not alone." Elsa took that as her cue and stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "You men are trespassing on my property," she called out, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I suggest you leave." Kruger looked at her with amusement. "Little lady, you don't want to get involved in this. This is business between old friends." "My property, my business," Elsa replied, raising the rifle to her shoulder. "And I'm not your little lady." The confrontation might have continued, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats from the direction of town drew everyone's attention. Tom Brennan was riding hard toward the ranch, and behind him came two other men, Elsa recognized as his sons. Kruger assessed the changing odds, and apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "This isn't over," he said to Shade, gesturing for his men to remount. "It is for today," Shade replied. As the three riders departed, Brennan and his sons arrived in the yard. Tom dismounted quickly and approached the porch, where Elsa still stood with the rifle. "Everyone all right?" he asked, his eyes taking in the scene. "We're fine," Elsa said, lowering the weapon. "Thanks to good timing." "Saw them riding toward your place," Brennan explained. "Something about them didn't sit right, so I thought we'd better check." Shade joined them on the porch, and Elsa could see that the confrontation had taken more out of him than he was letting on. His hands were steady, but there was something in his eyes that suggested the encounter had brought back memories he would rather forget. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "Probably with more men next time." "Then we'd better be ready for them," Elsa replied, surprising herself with her resolve. That evening, after Ben had returned to town with patches and assurances that the kitten was going to recover, Elsa and Shade sat on the porch and discussed their options. The confrontation had made it clear that hiding was no longer possible. Shade's enemies had found him, and they weren't going to give up. "I should leave," Shade said for the third time. "Take their attention away from you and the ranch." "And go where?" Elsa asked. "You said yourself that running doesn't solve anything. Better than bringing trouble to innocent people." "I'm not innocent," Elsa said firmly. I made the choice to bid on you at that auction, and I made the choice to keep you here even after I knew what kind of danger that might bring. Those were my decisions, and I stand by them. Shade looked at her in the lamplight, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Why? He asked quietly. Why take the risk? It was a question she had been asking herself for weeks, and the answer had become clearer with each passing day. She cared about him not just as hired help or even as a friend, but as a man whose redemption had become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Because everyone deserves a chance to become who they're meant to be, she said finally, and because I think you're becoming a good man, Shade. Maybe you always were, underneath everything else. He was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I never thought I'd have that chance again. Well, you do. We just have to make sure you live long enough to take it. As they sat together in the growing darkness, planning for the confrontation they both knew was coming, Elsa realized that somewhere along the way, saving the ranch had become less important than saving the man who had helped her repair it. The scared, broken stranger she had bought at auction had become something precious to her, and she was prepared to fight for him with everything she had. The only question was whether it would be enough. 2 days after the confrontation with Kruger and his men, Judge Morrison arrived at the ranch in his official capacity, carrying papers that would change everything Elsa thought she knew about the man she had purchased. Miss McKenna, the judge said, dismounting from his horse with the careful movements of a man whose arthritis was bothering him. I need to speak with you and your hired hand about a serious matter. Elsa felt dread settle in her stomach like a stone. Official visits from judges rarely brought good news, and the formal tone in Morrison's voice suggested this would be no exception. What kind of serious matter? She asked, stepping onto the porch. The kind that involves federal marshals and wanted posters, Morrison replied grimly. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. This came through official channels yesterday. The wanted poster was crisp and new, with sharp details that made Elsa's blood run cold. But it wasn't the image of Shade that shocked her, it was the name printed beneath, Samuel Cord, wanted for questioning in the massacre at Willow Creek, reward 500. Samuel Cord, she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. That would be his real name, Morrison confirmed. And according to this federal warrant, he's wanted in connection with the slaughter of the Harrison family last spring. 7 people killed, including 3 children. Elsa stared at the poster, her mind reeling. The Willow Creek massacre had been front-page news throughout the territory. An entire family wiped out in their home, with evidence suggesting the work of the Iron Veil gang. It had been one of the most brutal crimes in recent memory, and the territorial governor had offered a substantial reward for information leading to the capture of those responsible. Where is he? Morrison asked gently. Working in the back pasture, Elsa replied automatically, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. Miss McKenna, I know this is difficult, but I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. If this man is indeed Samuel Cord, then he's not just connected to the Iron Veil gangs, suspected of participating in one of their worst atrocities. The sound of approaching footsteps made both of them turn. Shade Samuel was walking toward the house, drawn by the sight of the judge's official visit. As he came closer, Elsa could see him take in the wanted poster in Morrison's hand, and his face went very still. Judge, he said quietly, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. Mr. Cord, Morrison replied, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. Or do you prefer another name these days? Shade will do fine. Morrison held up the wanted poster. Federal marshals are very interested in speaking with you about what happened at Willow Creek. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Elsa found herself studying Shade's face, looking for some sign of guilt or innocence, some indication of whether the man she had come to care about was capable of the kind of violence described in the newspapers. I was there, Shade said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The admission hit Elsa like a physical blow. She felt her knees weaken and had to grip the porch railing for support. The man who had gently mended a kitten's broken leg, who carved toys for children, who spoke soothingly to frightened animals. That man had been present at one of the most horrific crimes in territorial history. In what capacity? Morrison asked, his hand moving unconsciously toward the gun at his hip. As someone who tried to stop it. The statement hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Elsa looked between the two men, trying to understand what Shade meant. "Explain," Morrison said curtly. Shade climbed the porch steps slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible memory. Harrison family was supposed to be away that night. Word was they'd gone to visit relatives in Denver. The plan was simple: theft take what we could carry and move on. He paused, his eyes focused on something far beyond the horizon. But they came home early. "And?" Morrison prompted. "And everything went wrong. Harrison tried to defend his family. Shots were fired. By the time I realized what was happening, it was already too late for most of them." Elsa felt sick. "Most of them?" "Little girl hid in the root cellar when the shooting started. Annie, her name was. Maybe 8 years old." Shade's voice broke slightly. "When the others wanted to when they found her, I said no." "You protected her?" Morrison asked, his tone shifting slightly. "I got her out of there. Took her to the territorial marshal's office in Cameron Falls, made sure she was safe before I ran." Morrison frowned, consulting the papers he carried. According to the marshal's report, the child was found wandering the road by a passing freighter. No mention of anyone bringing her to safety. "Because I asked them not to mention it," Shade said. "I was already in deep enough trouble. Didn't need to make it worse by admitting I was there." "So you ran instead of staying to tell your side of the story? Would you have believed me?" Shade's laugh was bitter. "Man with an iron veil tattoo, claiming he tried to save the family his gang just murdered. I wouldn't have made it to trial." Elsa found her voice at last. "The little girl, Aniesh, could confirm what you're saying. If she remembers, if she's willing to talk about it. Last I heard, she was sent back east to live with relatives." Morrison was studying the wanted poster with new interest. "The description here is for someone wanted for questioning, not someone charged with a crime. That suggests the marshals aren't certain about his involvement." "They're certain enough to offer $500 for information," Elsa pointed out. "True, but there's something else you should know." Morrison reached into his coat again and withdrew a second document. This came with the federal paperwork. A letter from Marshal Thompson in Cameron Falls. He unfolded the letter and began to read. "Be advised that the child survivor of the Willow Creek incident has provided statements indicating that one member of the attacking party attempted to protect the family and was successful in ensuring her survival. Child describes this individual as tall, dark-haired, with facial scarring and a distinctive tattoo. Individual should be considered a potential witness rather than suspect, pending further investigation." The words hit Elsa like a bucket of cold water. Annie had remembered. The little girl Shade had saved was telling anyone who would listen that he had helped her, not harmed her. "Why wasn't this information made public?" she asked. "Federal marshals play things close to their vest," Morrison explained. "They want to find him and hear his story before word gets out that he might cooperate. If the Iron Veil gang thought he was talking to authorities, they'd kill him," Shade finished, "which is exactly what they're trying to do now." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place for Elsa. Shade hadn't just left the Iron Veil gang, had actively opposed them during their worst crime. That made him more than a deserter. It made him a traitor in their eyes, someone who had to be eliminated to prevent further betrayal. "The men who came here the other day," she said, "they weren't just looking for a former member. They were hunting someone who could destroy them." "Most likely," Morrison agreed. "Which brings us to the current situation. Mr. Cord, the federal marshals want to speak with you. If you surrender voluntarily and cooperate with their investigation, there's a good chance you'll be treated as a witness rather than a suspect. And if I don't, then the manhunt continues, and eventually someone less interested in your story and more interested in the reward money is going to find you." Shade was quiet for a long time, weighing his options. Elsa could see the conflict in his face, the desire to clear his name, warring with the ingrained distrust of authority that had kept him alive for so long. "There's one more thing," Morrison said gently. "The little girl Annie Harrison, she's been asking about you. Asking if the man who saved her is safe." That broke something in Shade's carefully controlled composure. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked like the lost, broken man Elsa had first seen on the auction platform. "She remembers?" "Everything, and she wants to thank you properly." Elsa stepped forward and placed her hand on Shade's arm. "You have to do it," she said quietly. "You have to tell them what really happened. It means leaving here, leaving you." His eyes met hers, and she saw fear there, not of the law or the marshals, but of losing the life he had begun to build at her ranch. "It means clearing your name. It means Annie gets justice for her family, and you get a chance at a real future, instead of always looking over your shoulder." Shade covered her hand with his own. "What if it doesn't work? What if they don't believe me? Then at least you'll have tried to do the right thing, and isn't that what matters?" Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "I can arrange safe passage to Cameron Falls. Marshal Thompson is a fair man, and with the child's testimony supporting your story, I believe you'll be treated well." "When?" Shade asked. "Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. I've already sent word that you might be ready to come in voluntarily." As the weight of the decision settled over them, Elsa realized that everything was about to change again. Just as she had found something worth fighting for, it was being taken away by circumstances beyond her control. But looking at Shade's face, seeing the hope that was beginning to replace the fear, she knew it was the right choice. He deserved the chance to clear his name and make peace with his past, even if it meant losing him. "I'll go," Shade said finally, "but I want to make sure Elsa is protected while I'm gone. Kruger and his men won't give up just because I'm not here anymore." "Tom Brennan has already offered to keep an eye on the ranch," Morrison said, "and I'll make sure the territorial sheriff increases patrols in this area." That evening, as they prepared for what might be their last night together, Elsa and Shade sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The wanted poster lay on the table between them, Samuel Cord's face staring up from the yellowed paper like an accusation from another life. "Samuel," Elsa said, testing the name, "it suits you better than Shade." "Does it? I've been Shade for so long. I sometimes forget I was ever anyone else." "Tell me about him. About Samuel Cord, before the Iron Veil gang." Shade Samuel was quiet for a long time before answering. He was a kid who lost his family to cholera when he was 16, lost the farm, lost everything. Thought joining up with dangerous men would make him feel less alone. He paused. Took him a long time to realize that being alone was better than being with the wrong people. "And what about now? Who is Samuel Cord now?" "I don't know yet. I guess that depends on what happens tomorrow." Elsa reached over and took his hand. "Whatever happens, you're not the same man who rode with the Iron Veil gang. These past weeks have shown me that much." "How can you be so sure?" "Because the man I've gotten to know would never hurt innocent people. He saves injured animals and calves, toys for children, and works from dawn to dusk to help a neighbor in need." She squeezed his hand. "That's not the actions of a killer, Samuel. That's the actions of someone with a good heart." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars appeared overhead. In the distance, they could hear the cattle settling for the night and the soft sounds of the prairie wind. It was peaceful in a way that made the approaching separation even more difficult to bear. "There's something I need to tell you," Samuel said suddenly. "Something I should have said before now." Elsa turned to look at him, noting the tension in his voice. "When I first saw you at the auction, when you bid on Mate wasn't random. I knew who you were." "What do you mean?" "Your father helped my brother once. Long time ago, before I got mixed up with the wrong people. Jacob, my brother, got thrown from a horse and broke his leg badly. Your father found him on the road and took him to the doctor in town, paid for his treatment even though he didn't know us from Adam." Elsa felt her breath catch. "Papa never mentioned." "Wouldn't have. That was the kind of man he was, helped people and forgot about it. But Jacob never forgot. He used to talk about the rancher who saved his life, how someday he was going to pay back that kindness." What happened to Jacob? Samuel's voice grew thick with grief. Fever took him 2 winters later, but before he died, he made me promise that if I ever had the chance to help the McKenna family, I would take it. So when you saw me at the auction, I saw a chance to keep a promise to my dying brother, maybe the only good promise I ever made. Samuel looked at her in the starlight. I wanted you to know that before I go. I wanted you to understand that this was never just about having a place to hide or work to do. It was about honoring the only family I had left. Elsa felt tears prick her eyes. The connection between them ran deeper than she had realized, rooted in her father's kindness and her brother's gratitude. It was as if fate had brought them together through a chain of compassion that stretched back years. Papa would be glad to know his kindness came back to help me, she said softly. I hope so. I hope Jacob would be glad too. They spent the rest of the evening making practical arrangements for the ranch's continued operation during Samuel's absence. Tom Brennan would check on the cattle daily, and his eldest son would help with any heavy repairs that couldn't wait. Elsa had enough supplies to last several weeks, and the well Samuel had repaired was producing plenty of water. But beneath the practical discussions lay an emotional undercurrent neither of them wanted to address directly. What if the federal marshals didn't believe Samuel's story? What if he was charged as an accomplice to murder rather than recognized as a witness? What if this goodbye was permanent? As they prepared to retire for the night, Samuel handed Elsa the completed wooden horse he had been carving for Ben. Give this to the boy when you see him next, he said. Tell him it's from a friend who hopes Patches makes a full recovery. Elsa took the carved horse, running her fingers over the smooth wood and careful details. It was beautiful work, clearly made with love and attention. Like everything else Samuel had done at the ranch, it spoke of someone who took pride in creating rather than destroying. I'll make sure he gets it. And Elsa, if something happens, if I don't come back, don't let anyone tell you that taking a chance on me was a mistake. These past weeks have been the best of my life, and that's because of your kindness. You're coming back, Elsa said firmly. Annie Harrison is going to tell them the truth, and you're going to clear your name, and then you're going to come home. The words slipped out before she could stop home, but looking at Samuel's face in the lamplight, she realized she meant it. Somewhere along the way, the ranch had become his home, and he had become an essential part of hers. I'd like that, he said quietly. I'd like that more than anything. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp air that promised the end of autumn and the approach of winter. Judge Morrison arrived promptly at 8 o'clock, accompanied by 2 federal deputies who would escort Samuel to Cameron Falls. The deputies were professional but courteous, treating Samuel more like a protected witness than a suspected criminal. Morrison had clearly briefed them on the situation, and they seemed genuinely interested in hearing his side of the story rather than simply bringing in another fugitive. As Samuel prepared to leave, he took one last look around the ranch that had become his sanctuary. The fences he had repaired stood straight and strong. The well he had fixed was producing clear, cold water. The barn where he had slept was organized and clean, a testament to his care and attention. Take care of yourself, he said to Elsa, his voice rough with emotion. You too. And remember, you're not alone in this. Annie Harrison is going to speak for you, and the truth is going to set you free. Samuel nodded, then surprised her by pulling something from his pocket. It was the blood-stained bandana he had shown her weeks earlier, the one that reminded him of his decision to save Annie Harrison's life. I want you to keep this, he said, pressing it into her hands, as a reminder that people can change, that good can come from the worst circumstances. Samuel, and as a promise that I'm coming back to you if it's humanly possible. He mounted the horse Judge Morrison had brought for him, and the small procession prepared to depart. As they rode away toward Cameron Falls and whatever judgment awaited there, Elsa stood on her porch, clutching the blood-stained cloth that represented both Samuel's past sins and his path to redemption. She watched until they disappeared over the hill, then turned back to face the ranch that suddenly seemed too quiet and too empty. but she carried with her the certainty that the man she had bought at auction for 2 silver coins had become something precious beyond measure, and that whatever the future held, her faith in him was justified. The only question now was whether the rest of the world would see what she had learned to see, that Samuel Cord was a good man who had found his way back from darkness, and that he deserved the chance to prove it. 5 days passed in anxious silence after Samuel's departure for Cameron Falls. Elsa threw herself into ranch work to keep her mind occupied, but every sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart race with hope that he had returned. Tom Brennan checked on her daily, as promised, and young Ben visited twice to see how Patches was recovering. The kitten was healing well, already trying to climb out of her basket despite the splint on her leg. On the 6th morning, as Elsa was feeding the chickens behind the barn, she spotted dust on the horizon, multiple riders approaching fast. Her first thought was that Samuel had returned, but as the group drew closer, she recognized the distinctive outline of Kruger and his men. This time, however, they had reinforcements, at least 6 riders instead of the original 3. Elsa ran for the house, grabbing her father's rifle and checking that it was loaded. She positioned herself at the kitchen window, where she could see the yard clearly while remaining under cover. The riders spread out as they approached, clearly intending to surround the house and prevent any escape. Kruger dismounted and walked toward the porch with the confident swagger of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "Miss McKenna," he called out, "we need to have ourselves a talk." "Say what you have to say from there," Elsa replied, her voice carrying through the open window. "Your hired hand seems to have disappeared. Federal marshals came sniffing around Cameron Falls, asking questions about the Willow Creek business. Funny thing is, we heard Samuel Cord might be cooperating with them." Elsa's blood ran cold. If Kruger knew Samuel's real name and his connection to the marshals, then someone with access to official information had provided it. The Iron Veil gang had sources inside the territorial government. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "Course you don't." Kruger's laugh was ugly. "But here's the thing we know, Cord was here, and we know you helped him. That makes you part of this business whether you want to be or not. I haven't broken any laws. Maybe not territorial laws, but gang law is different. See, when someone betrays the Iron Veil, everyone who helped them becomes a target. That's how we keep people from getting ideas about cooperation." One of Kruger's men was working his way around toward the back of the house, while another approached the barn. They were positioning themselves to attack from multiple directions, and Elsa realized she was badly outnumbered. "What do you want?" she asked, buying time while she tried to think of a plan. "We want to know exactly what Cord told the marshals. We want to know what kind of deal he made and what he might have said about our operations." Kruger stepped onto the porch. "And we want you to come with us to make sure he understands the consequences of his cooperation." The threat was clear. They intended to use her as leverage against Samuel, to force him to keep silent about what he knew. The realization that she had become a pawn in their deadly game filled Elsa with a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. "Go to hell," she said, and put a rifle bullet through the porch post inches from Kruger's head. The yard erupted into chaos as the outlaws scrambled for cover. Kruger dove behind a watering trough while his men spread out to find firing positions. Within seconds, bullets were flying in both directions, and Elsa realized she was in the fight of her life. She had perhaps a dozen shots before her ammunition ran out, and 6 men to contend with. The mathematics of survival were not in her favor, but she was determined to make them pay dearly for whatever they managed to accomplish. A bullet shattered the kitchen window, sending glass flying across the room. Elsa ducked low and moved to a different position, trying to keep her opponents guessing about her location. Through a gap in the curtains, she saw one of the men making a run for the house's back door. She intercepted him with a rifle shot that sent him sprawling in the dirt, wounded but not dead. The others responded with a volley that tore chunks of wood from the house's exterior walls. These men were experienced fighters, and they were systematically destroying her cover while advancing on the building. As she reloaded the rifle with hands that shook only slightly, Elsa found herself thinking about Samuel and wondering if he was safe in federal custody. She hoped he was, and she hoped he would understand that what was happening here wasn't his fault. She had made her own choices, and she was prepared to face the consequences. The sound of splintering wood from the back door told her that the outlaws had gained entry to the house. She had perhaps minutes before they reached her position, and her ammunition was nearly exhausted. It was time to make her last stand count. But as she prepared to face her attackers, the sound of distant gunfire from the direction of the road gave her pause. Someone else was shooting, and the bullets weren't aimed at the house. Confused shouts from Kruger's men suggested they were under attack from an unexpected direction. Through the broken window, Elsa saw riders approaching at full gallop, federal deputies with badges gleaming in the morning sun. At their head rode a tall figure in a dark coat that made her heart leap with recognition and disbelief. Samuel had returned, and he had brought help. The battle in the yard shifted dramatically as the federal deputies engaged Kruger's men from horseback. These were professional lawmen with superior firepower and tactical training, and the outlaws found themselves caught between Elsa's defensive position and the mounted attack from the road. Samuel dismounted while his horse was still moving and sprinted toward the house, his borrowed federal weapon cutting down one of Kruger's men who tried to intercept him. He reached the porch just as Kruger emerged from behind the watering trough, gun in hand. "Samuel Cord," Kruger snarled. "Should have known you'd come running back to protect your woman." "Should have known you'd be stupid enough to attack a federal witness under protection," Samuel replied, his own weapon trained on the outlaw leader. The two men faced each other across the bullet-scarred yard, and Elsa realized this confrontation represented more than just a gunfight. It was the final settling of accounts between Samuel's past and his future, between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. "You always were too soft for this work," Kruger sneered. "Saving little girls, protecting innocent families, that's not what the Iron Veil is about." "No," Samuel agreed. "That's why I left. And look where it got you. Federal lackey now, turning on your own kind." "They were never my kind," Samuel said firmly. "I just took too long to figure that out." The sheriff's badge pinned to Samuel's coat caught the sunlight, and Elsa's breath caught in her throat. Somehow, impossibly, he had not only cleared his name but had been deputized as a federal officer. The transformation from feared outlaw to lawman was complete. Kruger saw the badge too, and his face twisted with rage. "A badge won't change what you are, Cord, won't wash the blood off your hands." "Maybe not," Samuel replied, "but it's a start." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but the arrival of more federal deputies ended any possibility of the outlaws escaping. Kruger found himself surrounded and outgunned, his men either wounded or surrendering. The Iron Veil gang's reign of terror in the territory was over. As the dust settled and the wounded were tended to, Samuel holstered his weapon and climbed the porch steps toward where Elsa waited. His face was grim but determined, and she could see that the past week had changed him in fundamental ways. "You came back," she said simply. "I told you I would." "The badge. Marshal Thompson offered me a position after I testified about Willow Creek. Seems they need men who understand how outlaws think and operate." Samuel touched the star on his coat. "Figured it was a good way to make up for past mistakes." Elsa stepped forward and touched his face gently, assuring herself that he was real and unharmed. "What about us? What about the ranch?" "That depends on you," Samuel said quietly. "The Marshal Service would let me base my operations here, use the ranch as a safe house for witnesses and recovered victims. We'd be serving the law instead of running from it." The offer was more than Elsa had dared to hope for. Samuel would be able to stay, to build a life with her that was both honest and meaningful. The ranch would have a purpose beyond simple survival, and they would be part of something larger than themselves. And the Iron Veil gang? Finished. Kruger was their leader, and with him in custody, the others will scatter or surrender. The territory is going to be a safer place. As federal deputies led the captured outlaws away and medics tended to the wounded, Elsa and Samuel stood together on the porch of the ranch that had become their sanctuary. The battle was over. The past had been faced and conquered, and the future stretched ahead of them like an open road. "So what happens now?" Elsa asked. Samuel pulled her close, and for the first time since she had known him, his smile was completely free of shadows. "Now we get to find out who we are when we're not running from anything." The blood-stained bandana he had given her was still in her pocket, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had traveled. But looking at the badge on his coat and the hope in his eyes, Elsa knew the best part of their story was just beginning. The morning of the final confrontation began with an unusual visitor, Annie Harrison, now 9 years old, and accompanied by her aunt from Denver. Marshal Thompson had arranged for the child to travel to the ranch as part of Samuel's official vindication, and her testimony would serve as the final piece of evidence needed to close the Willow Creek case permanently. Elsa watched from the porch as the federal carriage approached, her heart tight with anticipation. This meeting between Samuel and the child he had saved would be crucial not just for the legal proceedings, but for his own healing from the trauma of that terrible night. Annie stepped down from the carriage with the careful dignity of a child who had experienced too much too young. She was small for her age, with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed far older than her years. Her aunt, a kind-faced woman named Catherine Morse, kept a protective hand on the girl's shoulder as they approached the house. "Miss McKenna," Mrs. Morse inquired. "I'm Catherine Morse, and this is my niece Annie. Marshal Thompson said we would find Deputy Cord here." "Yes, he's in the barn," Elsa replied, studying Annie's face. "He's been looking forward to seeing you again." Annie's expression brightened slightly. "Is he really a deputy now? Aunt Catherine said he helps catch bad men instead of being one." "That's right. He wears a badge and everything." The simplicity of the child's understanding touched Elsa deeply. To Annie, the transformation from outlaw to lawman was perfectly logical good. People did good things, regardless of what they might have done in the past. Samuel emerged from the barn at that moment, having heard the carriage arrive. He walked toward them slowly, his usual confidence tempered by obvious nervousness about the reunion. The last time he had seen Annie, she had been a terrified child covered in her family's blood. Now she was a young lady in a blue dress and polished shoes, but her eyes held the same trust he remembered. "Hello, Annie," he said gently, stopping a respectful distance away. "Hello, Mr. Samuel," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her face. "I've been wanting to thank you properly." "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you're safe and well." Annie stepped forward, studying his face with the intense concentration children brought to important moments. "You look different. Happier, I think." "I am happier. I found a good place to live and good people to care about. Aunt Catherine says you're helping other people now, like you helped me." "I'm trying to," Samuel said simply. The formal politeness of their conversation was touching but also heartbreaking. Elsa could see that both Samuel and Annie were struggling with the weight of shared trauma and the difficulty of moving beyond it. "Would you like to see the ranch?" Samuel asked. "Miss Elsa has some very friendly animals, and there's a kitten that's recovering from a broken leg." Annie's face lit up with genuine childish enthusiasm. "A kitten? Can I see it?" As they walked toward the barn where Patches was continuing her recovery, Annie slipped her small hand into Samuel's larger one with unconscious trust. The gesture seemed to break something open in his carefully controlled composure, and Elsa saw his eyes fill with tears he was too proud to shed. The visit continued peacefully through the morning, with Annie delighting in meeting the ranch animals and listening to stories about the work Samuel had been doing. She was particularly taken with Caesar, who seemed to sense her gentle nature and allowed her to brush his coat while Samuel held his halter. But the peaceful interlude was shattered by the sound of approaching riders, not the careful approach of federal officials, but the hard gallop of men in a hurry. Through the barn door, Elsa could see dust clouds rising from multiple directions, suggesting they were about to be surrounded. "Get Annie into the house," Samuel said sharply, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "This isn't part of the plan." Mrs. Morse gathered her niece quickly, understanding the urgency, even if she didn't comprehend the specific threat. As they hurried toward the house, Elsa counted at least 8 riders approaching from different directions, more than Kruger had brought before, and moving with military precision that suggested better leadership and planning. "I thought Kruger was in custody," she said to Samuel as they took defensive positions. "He is. But the Iron Veil was bigger than just him, and apparently some of the survivors have regrouped." Samuel checked his rifle and counted his ammunition. They must have learned Annie was coming here and saw it as their last chance to silence both of us permanently. The riders stopped just outside rifle range and dismounted, taking cover behind rocks and trees with practiced efficiency. Their leader was a lean man with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of hard living. When he called out to them, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Samuel Cord, I'm Pike Garrison, and I speak for what's left of the Iron Veil. We've come to settle accounts." "Accounts were settled when you chose to murder innocent families," Samuel called back. "If you've got business with me, it's with the federal marshals now." "The marshals aren't here, boy. It's just you and that woman and a little girl who's seen too much for her own good." The threat against Annie sent ice through Elsa's veins. These men weren't just seeking revenge against Samuel, they intended to eliminate the key witness who could testify against other surviving gang members. "The child has nothing to do with this," Samuel shouted. "Child has everything to do with this. Her testimony put 3 of our men in territorial prison, and there's more trials coming. Can't have that." Samuel's face went very pale as he understood the full scope of the threat they faced. Annie's survival had been more than just a moral victory. It had provided the federal authorities with detailed information about Iron Veil operations and personnel. Her continued existence threatened the freedom of every surviving gang member. "What do you want?" Samuel asked, though they all knew the answer. "Want you to come out with your hands up, you and the girl. Make this quick and clean, and maybe the woman lives to tell about it." It was no choice at all, really. If Samuel surrendered, both he and Annie would be killed immediately. If he fought, they were vastly outnumbered, but at least had a chance of holding out until help arrived, if help was coming at all. "Federal deputies are on their way," Samuel called out, though Elsa wasn't sure if it was true or just a bluff. "No, they're not," Garrison replied with confidence. "We made sure they got called away on false reports. It's going to be just us for quite a while." The confirmation that this attack had been carefully planned sent another chill through Elsa. The Iron Veil had anticipated the meeting with Annie and had taken steps to ensure they would face no interference from federal authorities. "Samuel," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." "What?" "I sent word to Tom Brennan yesterday that Annie was coming. If anything seemed wrong, he was supposed to gather men and come running." Samuel's expression flickered with hope, but also concern. "Brennan's a good man, but he's not a gunfighter. Neither are his sons or the other ranchers around here." "Maybe not, but they're good shots and they know this land. If we can hold out long enough." A rifle shot cut off her words, and wood splintered from the barn door as the Iron Veil opened fire. The final battle for Samuel's redemption and Annie's life had begun. As bullets flew and smoke filled the air, Elsa found herself thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A desperate auction bid, a man with a feared tattoo, a child who remembered kindness in the midst of horror. All of it had led to this morning, when everything would be decided by courage and the hope that good people would stand together against evil. The smoking gun in Samuel's hands represented more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of his transformation from someone who took lives to someone who protected them. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether that transformation could survive its ultimate test. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Elsa had ever experienced. The Iron Veil survivors fought with the desperate fury of men who knew capture meant the gallows, while Samuel defended his new life with the skill of someone who understood exactly what he stood to lose. From her position in the barn loft, Elsa could see the tactical situation clearly. Pike Garrison had positioned his men in a rough circle around the ranch buildings, but the hastily formed siege had weaknesses that Samuel was quick to exploit. His years of outlaw experience, now turned to lawful purpose, allowed him to anticipate their movements and counter their advances. "There," Samuel called up to her, pointing toward a cluster of rocks where two of Garrison's men were trying to work closer to the house. "Can you get a shot?" Elsa steadied her father's rifle against the loft window and squeezed off a careful shot. One of the outlaws yelped and dove for better cover. His advance stopped for the moment. She wasn't trying to kill, she had never killed a man, and wasn't sure she could, but she could certainly make their lives difficult. In the house, Annie and her aunt had taken shelter in the root cellar, the safest place on the property during a gunfight. Mrs. Morse had proven surprisingly calm under pressure, helping to barricade the cellar door and keeping Annie occupied with quiet stories while bullets flew overhead. The battle might have continued indefinitely, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats from the north changed everything. Tom Brennan and a group of neighboring ranchers came riding hard toward the ranch, their rifles ready and their intentions clear. They might not be professional gunfighters, but they were men defending their community against outside threats. "Cavalry's coming," Elsa called down to Samuel. Pike Garrison had heard the approaching riders too, and his tactical situation was rapidly deteriorating. Caught between the defensive positions around the ranch and the mounted attack from the road, his men began to waver. Several started looking for escape routes rather than pressing their assault. "This ain't over, Cord," Garrison shouted, apparently deciding that discretion was indeed the better part of valor. "We know where you live now." "Federal marshals know where you live too," Samuel replied, "and they're a lot better at tracking than you are at hiding." The outlaws began a fighting withdrawal toward their horses, laying down covering fire while they retreated. But their escape was cut short by another group of riders approaching from the east. The federal deputies who had been delayed by false reports were finally arriving on the scene. Marshal Thompson himself led the charge, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun as he and his men surrounded the remaining Iron Veil survivors. The outlaws found themselves trapped between multiple forces with nowhere to run. Pike Garrison made one last, desperate attempt to salvage something from the failed assault. He broke cover and sprinted toward the house, apparently intending to take hostages or go down fighting. But Samuel was ready for him. The two men faced each other in the ranch yard, and for a moment time seemed suspended. Garrison was fast and experienced, his gun clearing leather with practiced ease. But Samuel was faster, driven by the need to protect everything he had come to value. The truth-telling letter in Garrison's coat pocket, Annie's written testimony about the Willow Creek massacre, fell to the ground as the outlaw leader collapsed. The document that had helped clear Samuel's name and convict other gang members was stained now with the blood of the man who had tried to suppress it. As the echoes of gunshots faded and the smoke cleared, an unusual quiet settled over the ranch. The surviving Iron Veil members surrendered to the federal deputies. Their reign of terror finally ended. Neighbors dismounted and began checking for wounded, while Marshal Thompson surveyed the scene with professional satisfaction. Samuel holstered his gun and walked toward the house, his steps careful and measured. The transformation from feared outlaw to respected lawman was complete, sealed by his defense of an innocent child and the community that had given him sanctuary. Elsa climbed down from the barn loft and met him halfway across the yard. Without speaking, they embraced, both shaking with relief and adrenaline. The battle was over, but more importantly, the war between Samuel's past and future had been decided in favor of redemption. "Is everyone all right?" Samuel asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Annie and her aunt are safe in the cellar. Tom Brennan's checking on his men, but I think we all came through without serious injury." Annie emerged from the house at that moment, having heard the shooting stop. She ran directly to Samuel and threw her small arms around his waist, clinging to him with the fierce gratitude of a child who understood that he had risked everything to keep her safe. "Thank you," she whispered against his shirt. "Thank you for saving me again." Samuel knelt down to her level, his eyes bright with unshed tears. You don't need saving anymore, Annie. You're strong and brave, and you're going to grow up to do wonderful things. But if you ever need help, if you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." Annie nodded solemnly, then surprised him by reaching into a small purse and withdrawing something wrapped in tissue paper. "I brought you something," she said. "Aunt Catherine helped me make it." Inside the tissue was a small badge cut from tin and carefully polished. On it, someone had engraved the words, "My hero," in childish but determined letters. "It's not a real badge," Annie said anxiously, "but I wanted you to have something to remember that you're a good man who saves people." Samuel accepted the makeshift badge with hands that trembled slightly. "It's the most important badge I've ever received," he said solemnly. "I'll treasure it always." Marshal Thompson approached as this exchange was taking place, his own expression softened by the scene. "Deputy Cord," he said formally, "your conduct today exemplifies the finest traditions of federal law enforcement. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude." "Just doing my job, Marshal." "No, son. You went well beyond duty today. You protected a federal witness and helped end the Iron Veil threat permanently. That kind of courage deserves recognition." As the various officials began the process of documenting the scene and preparing reports, Elsa found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this point. The blood-stained bandana that Samuel had given her was still in her pocket, a reminder of how far he had traveled from the desperate man on the auction platform to the respected lawman he had become. The ranch yard showed the scars of battle bullet holes in the barn walls, trampled earth where men had fought and died, broken windows that would need repair. But it also showed signs of hope, neighbors working together to help clean up, federal deputies treating Samuel as a trusted colleague, and Annie playing with Patches the kitten, while her aunt spoke quietly with Marshal Thompson about future safety arrangements. As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the last of the official business was concluded. The bodies were removed, the prisoners transported to territorial prison, and the witnesses dismissed. Annie and her aunt would return to Denver with a federal escort, their safety assured now that the Iron Veil threat was permanently eliminated. "Will I see you again?" Annie asked Samuel as she prepared to leave. "I hope so," Samuel replied, crouching down to her level one more time. "And when you're older, if you ever want to visit the ranch, you'll always be welcome here. Promise?" "I promise." Annie hugged him one last time, then climbed into the federal carriage with her aunt. As the vehicle rolled away toward town, she waved from the window until they disappeared over the hill. Samuel stood watching long after the carriage was gone, his hand unconsciously touching the small tin badge Annie had given him. When he finally turned back toward the house, Elsa was waiting for him on the porch. "So what happens now?" she asked, echoing the question that had become their refrain. "Now we rebuild," Samuel said, gesturing toward the bullet-scarred ranch buildings. "Fix what got broken, replace what got destroyed, and keep moving forward." "And the badge? The federal service?" "Marshal Thompson wants me to stay on, work as a special deputy for cases involving organized gangs and witness protection, based here at the ranch, like we discussed." Samuel looked at her carefully. "But only if that's what you want too." Elsa smiled, feeling a lightness in her chest that she hadn't experienced since before her parents died. "I can't think of anything I'd want more." As they stood together on the porch of the ranch that had become their sanctuary and their battleground, Elsa realized that they had achieved something remarkable. Samuel had found his way back from the darkness of his past, and she had found the strength to fight for what mattered most. Together, they had proven that redemption was possible, that people could change, and that love could triumph over fear. The truth-telling letter that had helped exonerate Samuel lay on the kitchen table inside, stained with Pike Garrison's blood but still legible. It would go into the federal files as evidence, but its real importance lay in what it represented: the power of truth to overcome lies, of courage to defeat cruelty, of hope to conquer despair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges repairs to make, reports to file, a future to build together. But tonight, as the stars emerged over the peaceful ranch, Samuel Cord and Elsa McKenna could rest in the knowledge that they had faced their greatest test and emerged victorious. The man with the feared tattoo had become a protector of the innocent, and the woman who had bet everything on his redemption had won the greatest gamble of her life. 6 months after the final confrontation with the Iron Veil Gang, the McKenna Ranch had been transformed into something that neither Robert McKenna nor his daughter could have imagined. The bullet holes in the barn had been repaired and painted over, but more importantly, new buildings had been added. A small office where Samuel conducted his federal business, a secure cabin for witnesses who needed protection, and a workshop where he had begun crafting furniture during his free time. The workshop was where Elsa found him on a crisp spring morning, carefully sanding a wooden cradle that he had been working on for weeks. The piece was beautiful in its simplicity, with gentle curves and a strength that promised to protect whatever precious cargo it might hold. "It's finished," Samuel said, looking up as she entered. "What do you think?" Elsa ran her fingers over the smooth wood, marveling at the craftsmanship. "It's perfect. She's going to love it." The cradle was intended for Annie Harrison, who had written to tell them that her Aunt Catherine was expecting a baby. The gift represented more than just skilled woodworking. It was a symbol of the new life that could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. "Any word from Marshal Thompson about the Colorado assignment?" Elsa asked, settling down beside Samuel on a wooden stool. "He wants us to leave next week. There's a family in Denver who witnessed a robbery, and they need protection until the trial." Samuel set down his sandpaper and reached for Elsa's hand. "Are you sure you don't mind the traveling? It's not what you signed up for when you bid on me at that auction." Elsa laughed, a sound that had become much more frequent in recent months. "I didn't sign up for any of this. I thought I was buying help with fence repairs, not a husband who fights outlaws for a living." The word husband still felt new on her tongue. They had been married 2 months ago in a simple ceremony at the church in Grim Hollow, with Tom Brennan giving her away and young Ben Morrison serving as ring-bearer. Annie had sent a letter from Denver expressing her disappointment at missing the wedding, along with a beautiful hand-embroidered tablecloth that now graced their kitchen table. "Any regrets?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying just a hint of the old uncertainty. "Only that it took me so long to realize I was falling in love with you," Elsa replied honestly. "I knew you were a good man long before I admitted to myself that you were the right man." Samuel smiled and reached into his shirt pocket, withdrawing a letter that had arrived with the morning mail. "Speaking of good news, this came from the Territorial Governor's office." Elsa opened the official envelope and read the formal language with growing amazement. The letter announced that Samuel Cord had been awarded the Territorial Medal for Distinguished Service in Law Enforcement, specifically for his role in dismantling the Iron Veil Gang and protecting federal witnesses. The ceremony would be held in the territorial capital, with full recognition of his transformation from outlaw to exemplary lawman. "Samuel, this is wonderful. A territorial medal. It's just a piece of metal," Samuel said, though his pleased expression belied his modest words. "The real reward is being able to wake up every morning knowing I'm doing something useful with my life." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the window. A federal carriage was coming up the road, and Elsa could see Marshal Thompson's distinctive figure in the driver's seat. But there was something unusual about this visit. The marshal was not alone. As the carriage drew closer, they could see a small passenger in the back seat, a girl with dark hair and a blue dress that fluttered in the spring breeze. Annie Harrison had come for an unexpected visit, and her presence could only mean one thing. She had something important to tell them. Samuel and Elsa hurried outside to greet their visitors. Annie practically bounced out of the carriage before it had completely stopped, her face bright with excitement and news. "Miss Elsa, Mr. Samuel, I have so much to tell you." Marshal Thompson dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had spent too many hours in the saddle. "Miss Annie insisted on making this trip personally," he explained. "She has some news she wanted to share in person." Annie rushed to Samuel and hugged him tightly, then turned to include Elsa in her embrace. At 10 years old now, she had grown taller and more confident, but her eyes still held the special warmth she reserved for the people who had saved her life. Aunt Catherine had her baby, Annie announced. A little boy named Samuel Robert, after you and Miss Elsa's papa. And I wanted to give you this. She reached into her small purse and withdrew a folded piece of paper. When Samuel opened it, he found a child's drawing of a ranch, with stick figures representing him and Elsa, surrounded by horses and cattle and flowers. At the bottom, in careful lettering, Annie had written, "My family. I drew it for you because even though we don't live together, you're still my family," Annie explained seriously. "Aunt Catherine says family is the people who love you and take care of you, and that's what you did for me." Samuel knelt down to Annie's level, his eyes bright with emotion. "You're our family too, Annie. You always will be." "Really? Even when I grow up and get married and have children of my own?" "Especially then," Elsa said, joining the conversation. "In fact, we're hoping you'll bring your children to visit the ranch someday, so they can meet their Uncle Samuel and Aunt Elsa." Annie's face lit up with delight at this prospect. "Can I really? Can I bring them to see the horses and learn to ride?" "As often as you want," Samuel promised. Marshal Thompson cleared his throat diplomatically. "I hate to interrupt this reunion, but we do have some official business to discuss. Annie, why don't you go see if that kitten of yours is around while I talk to Deputy Cord?" Annie ran off toward the barn, calling for Patches, who was now a fully grown cat with a barely perceptible limp from her old injury. The marshal watched her go with a fond expression before turning to Samuel with a more serious demeanor. "The territorial governor wants to offer you a promotion," Thompson said without preamble. "Chief of the new organized crime division, based out of the capital. It would mean more money, more prestige, and a chance to shape law enforcement policy for the entire territory." It was an impressive offer, one that represented the ultimate vindication of Samuel's transformation from outlaw to lawman, but Elsa could see him weighing the opportunity against what he would have to give up. "What would it mean for our work here?" Samuel asked. "The witness protection, the ranch operations?" "You'd have to relocate to the capital. The ranch could still be used as a safe house, but you wouldn't be based here anymore." Samuel looked at Elsa, and she could read the question in his eyes. This was the kind of opportunity that came once in a lifetime, a chance to make a real difference in territorial law enforcement. But it would also mean leaving the place where they had found each other and built their life together. "What do you think?" he asked her quietly. Elsa considered the question carefully. The ranch had been her anchor through difficult times, the place where her family's legacy lived on. But looking around at the improvements Samuel had made, the life they had built together, she realized that home wasn't really about a place, it was about the people you chose to share it with. "I think," she said slowly, "that home is wherever we're together. And if you want to take this position, if you think you can do more good in the capital, then that's where we should go." Samuel's smile was radiant. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Besides, someone needs to keep the territorial capital's newest law enforcement chief humble. Remind him that he used to be a ranch hand who couldn't properly milk a cow." "I could too milk a cow." "Not without getting kicked, you couldn't." Their playful argument was interrupted by Annie's return, carrying Patches in her arms. The cat had grown into a beautiful calico with intelligent green eyes and a purr that could be heard across the yard. "She remembers me," Annie announced triumphantly, "and look, you can barely see where her leg was broken." It was true. Patches showed no sign of her old injury, except for the faintest irregularity in her gait. Like Samuel himself, she had healed from her wounds and become stronger for having survived them. As the afternoon wore on, they shared a meal on the porch and talked about the future. Annie would finish her schooling in Denver, then consider attending the new territorial college that was being established. Samuel would take the promotion and work to make the territory safer for families like the Harrisons. Elsa would learn to navigate the social complexities of the territorial capital while maintaining her support for witness protection programs. When it came time for Annie to leave, she hugged them both fiercely and made them promise to write regularly. "And when you have children of your own," She said to Elsa with the confident prediction of childhood, "I want to be their honorary big sister." "I think that can be arranged," Elsa replied, exchanging a meaningful glance with Samuel. As the federal carriage disappeared over the hill, carrying Annie back toward town and eventually to Denver, Samuel and Elsa stood together on the porch of the ranch that had been their sanctuary and their proving ground. "Any second thoughts about leaving all this?" Samuel asked, gesturing toward the familiar landscape. "None," Elsa replied firmly. "This place gave us what we needed: time to heal, space to grow, a chance to discover who we could become together. But we don't need it anymore. We can take what matters with us." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the blood-stained bandana that Samuel had given her months ago, the one that represented his journey from violence to healing. It was faded now, worn soft by handling and washing, but it still carried the weight of memory and transformation. "We're taking this," she said, holding up the cloth, "and the wedding ring that belonged to my grandmother, and the wooden horse you carved for Ben, which his grandmother returned to us after he outgrew toys, and all the other small things that remind us of where we started and how far we've traveled." Samuel nodded, understanding. "And we're leaving the rest?" "We're leaving the rest to the next people who need a fresh start. Tom Brennan's youngest son is getting married next month, and he's been looking for a place to ranch. This could be perfect for them." As the sun set over the mountains one last time from their porch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel and Elsa made their plans for the future. They would sell the ranch to young Brennan with the understanding that it would remain available as a federal safe house when needed. They would move to the territorial capital and build a new life in service to justice and protection of the innocent. But most importantly, they would carry with them the lessons learned in this place, that redemption was possible, that love could overcome fear, that the bravest thing anyone could do was bet everything on someone everyone else had given up on. Sometimes the greatest transformations began with the smallest acts of faith: a desperate bid at an auction, a willingness to see past a feared tattoo to the man beneath, a decision to stand and fight when running would have been easier. As they walked hand in hand toward the house they would soon leave behind, Elsa reflected on the strange chain of events that had brought them together. She had gone to that auction looking for help with fence repairs and had found instead the love of her life and a purpose larger than herself. Samuel had arrived at the ranch as a broken man running from his past and had discovered that home wasn't a place you found, but something you built with the people who chose to stand beside you through whatever storms might come. Their story had begun with iron shackles and 2 silver coins, but it would continue with federal badges and wedding rings, with children to raise and criminals to apprehend, with a legacy of service that would honor both their families and their shared commitment to justice. And sometimes, late at night, when the territorial capital seemed too busy and complex, they would think of the ranch where their love had taken root and remember that the best things in life often began with the courage to take a chance on someone else's redemption.